Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Church Dogmatics by Emil Brunner, published in German in 1946. We're going to take a look at chapter 4 in its entirety. It was a short chapter. It'll be 118 to 132, and it's on the consequence of sin. So we will cover the entire chapter. It was a short chapter after all. So 118 to 132 on the consequence of sin. Let's go to block 1. And Brunner says the first consequence of sin is loss of personal relationship. With all of Brunner's emphasis on personalism, he says the first consequence of sin is loss of personal relationship. Coming under the wrath of God, our existence is determined according to relation with God, because God is a subject in relation, and we are called to love in return as communion with God. Apostasy creates a loss of this freedom to respond. So it's loss of the freedom to respond, and Brunner goes to John 8:34. Whoever commits sin is the servant of sin. We no longer have the ability to order life according to the divine teleology, the divine telos. And he goes to Psalm 18:26 and 27. With the pure, you will show yourself as pure. With the perverse, you will show yourself in opposition. In sin, we feel God's resistance. We feel God's wrath. But the key loss here is in note 3. The law replaces personal relationship. Man's freedom takes place within dependence on God. The sin of Adam was to seek for self-serving autonomy. It resulted in alienation away from the love of God. Communion in love is replaced by abstract, authoritative law, and we end up with a representative presence of God with law as mediation. That is the fundamental and most profound loss as a consequence of sin. And Brunner is right. That's absolutely what happened. Loss of personal relationship. Because what does Christ do? He restores personal relationship. So the first consequence of sin is this terrible loss of personal relationship with the God of agape. Let's go on to block 2. Now he wants to discuss the consequence of sin and the twofold aspect of the image of God. Image of God has a twofold aspect. Unfreedom as a consequence. Christianity very early on took a stand against Greek determinism. The self possesses a dignity and a responsibility given by God. Augustine posited the nature of sin as unfreedom, the loss of the ability to realize our divine destiny. So Brunner says we need to look at original freedom and the image of God. The self is in need of redemption. We are not caught up into a deterministic predestination because we learned in a previous lesson, predestination demands responsible participation. We must reflect the agape of God, and this is lost due to sin. Now here's your key point for block 2, note 3, the self's need for redemption. Image of God has two aspects. There's the formal or the essential as a permanent creation by God that can never be lost, that can never ever be lost. But then there's the material realization of the image of God, and that can be lost due to slavery of sin. So that the essential image of God is a permanent creation that cannot be lost ever. But we don't always realize that potentiality. So the material realization of the image of God that can be hindered, that can be damaged, that can be lost due to the slavery of sin. Sin causes us to be unable to reflect the agape of God. Loss of divine likeness points to our need for redemption. Again, the need for redemption. Let's go on to block 3. And he really nails it here. The consequence of sin as individualism or collectivism. And he says collectivism, but I say intersubjectivity. That's the sin of today's culture, intersubjectivity. Ethics is defined by the social subjective consciousness, intersubjectivity. And that is a horrible consequence because absolute truth is denied. Transcendence of God is denied. Realm of spirit is denied. And we have a collective intersubjectivity that says, here's what the culture believes to be moral. This is what the culture believes to be true. We believe in a relative truth. And that's, to me, is now Brunner calls it collectivism. I call it intersubjectivity. And he says that's the ultimate consequence, individualism or intersubjectivity. The self in rebellion fights the nature that God created in us. There's a division within the self. There's a division within the self. Fragmentation. Remember, irene, peace, in Greek, is always healing of fragmentation. So the self is fragmented, in need of the healing of fragmentation. And this is expressed in Romans 7:19. We all know this verse. Paul says, the good that I would, I do not. The evil that I would not, that I do. And that is every self's confession. We all are guilty, and we are all in need of repentance. But Paul expresses it concerning himself in Romans 7:19. Now the perversity of the self is expressed in 2 ways, says Brunner, in self-deification or deification of the world, egoism or seeking pleasure in the world. The self exists in a state of conflict. Man turns to secularism or to legalistic, ritualistic, formal religion. And we see that many, many times. So 3:3, the fallen dialectic, consists of that individualism and collectivism, or individualism and intersubjectivity. True community is misunderstood altogether. Cynicism, or Hegelian idealism, becomes the new norm. And in our culture, it's cynicism. It's the declaration that there's no God. God is ignored. No one lives a life of thankfulness toward God. That is the greatest sin of all, ignoring the Creator, not living a life of thankfulness toward the God who has immeasurably blessed us. That's a horrible consequence of sin. We turn away. We live in a culture of cynicism and intersubjectivity. That's it. We live in a culture of cynicism and intersubjectivity. Truth has become relative intersubjectivity. Morality is described according to relative intersubjectivity. So I agree completely with what Brunner says here. That is the horrible consequence of sin. It becomes an infection. It infects an entire culture. So, fundamentally, I think Block 1 and Block 3 have to have the greatest amount of attention because what he said in Block 1 is true. The consequence of sin is loss of personal relationship with God our Father. And that restoration of personal relationship is only through Christ. Only through the cross and the resurrection of Christ can personal relationship with our Father in heaven be restored. And then for the image of where we're at today, it's block 3. Sin has infected the culture, and we have a culture of cynicism and intersubjectivity. Collective intersubjectivity defines the truth. Collective intersubjectivity defines morality. And we all know morality has been stood on its head. We have so perverted the moral, ethical nature of society, it's terrible, but it's because we've become our own gods. Now it's a truth based on relative intersubjectivity within our culture. It has become an infective disease that has contaminated our culture. But what Brunner rightly teaches is that what happened was a loss of personal relationship, and what got restored was a mediation. And that mediation was the law, a very impersonal law, became the mediation between humanity and God. Personal relationship, personalism was lost. Christ came to restore personal relationship with the God who he said we need to call our Father in heaven. Christ said, I bring restored personal relationship, call God our Father in heaven. Call him Father. So loss of personal relationship is restored in the cross and the resurrection of Christ, and only in the cross and resurrection of Christ. And it does restore and correct the horrible consequence of sin, which is a collective intersubjectivity and cynicism in today's culture, where shared subjective truth, intersubjectivity, becomes the norm, which means all truth is relative. And there's no belief in transcendence. There's no belief in realm of spirit. There's no turning toward God. There's no living of a life of thankfulness toward God. We've lost that living of life toward, in a thankful spirit toward the God we should never ignore. Horrible sin. And it has resulted in a disease of collective intersubjectivity in our culture. That's going to wrap up 118 to 132. That's all of chapter 4. So the next lesson goes on to chapter 5, 133 to 147. So we'll look at 133 to 147, chapter 5, next time. That wraps up chapter 4 on the consequence of sin as collective intersubjectivity.